research within social psychology. In the beginning, I mean way in the beginning, social psych was built on the ashes of World War II by Jewish social scientists who escaped Nazi Germany to come to the United States. When they got here, they naturally wanted to study prejudice, starting with anti-Semitism, which is prejudice against Jews. They were just flummoxed. They said, you know, we're here now, we're safe, but we want to figure out how it is that Jews and German Christians live together for decades, forever, harmoniously, and then all of a sudden they want to exterminate us. What's going on with that? So they started out with anti-Semitism, but by the 1950s they had expanded to include prejudices based on race, ethnicity, your country of origin, and class, but not gender. Gordon Allport kicked off the nature of prejudice in 1954 with a book by that title. It's a seminal book in social psychology, The Nature of Prejudice. And here's what he said about gender. He wrote that misogynists viewed women as their inferiors. Misogynists are women haters. But he characterized them as rare, stating that for many people, this so-called war of the sexes seems totally unreal. They do not find in it a ground for prejudice. So he wrote that early in his book on page 34, and that was it. He didn't come back to it. Even though he listed official forms of discrimination as recognized by the United Nations as follows: inequality in access to public office, the enjoyment of free choice of employment, you can have whatever job you want, and the regulation and treatment of ownership, the ability to run for public office, have the job you want, and to own anything you like. He writes that, and yet he failed to notice how those criteria readily applied to women in 1954. Half the population. Women are half the population. How do you miss it? Unequal access to public office. Women today are just a quarter of Congress, but that's better than in the 1950s when there were no female lawmakers. As for free choice in employment, back then, the newspaper want ads were wholly segregated by gender. A woman could not even apply for a job in the men's section. Regulation of ownership. Women were not allowed to have credit, so they couldn't buy property. Any house or cars or appliances in the home were in the husband's name. He owned all of it. How could Allport have missed gender prejudice? In many ways, he's a genius, but he was blind to sexism. Of course, so did every other male scientist miss sexism back then, perhaps because the word sexism wasn't coined until the mid-1970s. Before the women's movement, what we call the second wave of the women's movement, it was just called life. Women just swam in a sea of sexism and nobody had a name for it. As we'll see, it took a female social scientist to start gender research in 1972. But there's another reason why Allport might have missed the obvious. It's because the way he defined prejudice as an antipathy based upon a faulty or inflexible generalization, translation, a hostility based on negative stereotypes. However, this definition does not fully capture gender prejudice, which is often paternalistic, and the name that we have for that is benevolent sexism. And so while Allport downplayed the hostile sexism that did and does exist, he was ill-equipped with this definition to see sexism's complexities and therefore its prevalence. So let's start over. Take two. In the beginning, gender prejudice research began serendipitously with a cocktail party and a New Yorker cartoon. Janet Spence met Robert Helmreich at a party in New York, and both were struck by a cartoon in which a man said to his dinner date, "You are really stupid. I like that in a woman." It was a New Yorker cartoon. So he's sitting at the table with his dinner date, and he says to her, "You are really stupid. I like that in a woman. So this cartoon gave them a research idea. Robert had recently found that competent men were liked more than incompetent men, and Janet wondered whether the effect would be reversed for women. Would people like incompetent women more, as the cartoon would suggest? The result was their seminal study, Who Likes Competent Women, which was published in 1972. In order to find out who likes competent women, they had to design the very first measure of sexism, and they called it the Attitudes Towards Women scale. Here are sample items from the Attitudes Towards Women scale. In general, the father should have greater authority than the mother in the bringing up of the children, and people responded to that on like a 1 to 7 point scale, with strongly disagree being 1, strongly agree being 7. I'm sure you've seen those scales. Often they're called Likert scales. Another item, sons in the family should be given more encouragement to go to college than daughters. A third item, a woman should not expect to go to the same places or to have the same freedom as a man. Another item is swearing and obscenity are more repulsive in the speech of a woman than a man. There were, I think they started out with something like 30 items. And the results showed that, as they predicted, only people who scored low on the Attitudes Towards Women scale would like competent women, and that's what they found. Okay, people who scored high on the Attitudes Towards Women scale liked incompetent women more than competent women, vice versa for people who scored low. Now, in so doing, they effectively launched gender research in my field, and dozens of studies used the AWS until it became outdated in the 1980s. Oh, why did it? It became outdated in the 1980s because participants would just start circling 1 all the way down on each item. Strongly disagree, strongly disagree, strongly disagree, right? The items were too blatantly sexist for people to agree with them by the late 1980s. So besides attitudes towards women, researchers have also investigated gender stereotypes, which have, unlike attitudes towards women, remained stable over time. So here they are in a nutshell. Men are viewed as more ambitious, dominant, rational, competent, powerful, able, compared with women. In a word, men are seen as more agentic. Now, that's a word you won't find in the English dictionary. The closest you come to it is agency. But in psychology, in a psychological dictionary, you would find it, and it means like self-motivating, self-reliant, independent, and self-propelling. Okay, so men are more ambitious, dominant, rational, competent, powerful, able, in a word, agentic. How are women perceived? They are seen as more supportive, loving, kind, sensitive to others, helpful, nice. In a word that you will find in the English dictionary, communal. So men are thought to be sort of self-oriented, and women are thought to be sort of other-oriented, right? Agentic, self-oriented, communal, other-oriented. That's one way to think about it. Notice how these male stereotypes map onto career orientation and leadership qualities, whereas female stereotypes map onto motherhood. No wonder men are viewed as more fit for high-status jobs, right? They're stereotyped as being more fit for leadership roles. The solution, therefore, seemed simple. To combat gender stereotypes, women just need to act like men. They need to be more agentic, right? More ambitious, more self-promoting, demonstrate their ability in a sort of a showy way. And then that would solve sexism in the workplace. People would stop stereotyping men and women differently. But hang on, not so fast. What happened instead, and I was instrumental in starting the discovery of this, was the discovery of backlash, which is prejudice against agentic women. It turns out people don't like women who act like leaders, meaning who act like men. So that led researchers to conclude that there's actually two types of stereotypes. There's descriptive and prescriptive. And you'll see that male agency is a prescriptive stereotype, and that's why women get into trouble if they act too agentic. Okay, but I don't want to get too far ahead. So what's the difference between descriptive and prescriptive stereotypes? Descriptive stereotypes describe how men and women typically are. Atypical men and women may raise eyebrows, but not hackles. People don't get upset if you are breaking a descriptive stereotype. Examples: men are taller, but tall women are not shunned, and tall women who are models are absolutely glorified, right? Women do live longer than men, but men who live to be 100 or more are just as celebrated as super senior women. Whereas prescriptive stereotypes prescribe, just the way a pharmacist prescribes medication, how men and women should be. These are gender rules that, if you violate them, you can get into trouble. You are at risk for harsh social penalties. For example, men should be brave. So a man who cowers behind his girlfriend when a dog snarls at a couple, that man is ridiculed. Also, women should not dominate men, so female leaders risk backlash. Gender, it turns out, compared with other social groups, is uniquely prescriptive. It turns out there's lots of rules for men and women, and they're stricter for gender than other social categories such as race and nationality. Examples: blacks are stereotyped as more athletic than whites. Remember, they used to be stereotyped as too weak to be professional athletes or to compete in the Olympics, and now that stereotype has done a 180, right? But even despite the fact that blacks are stereotyped as more athletic than whites, non-athletic blacks are not spurned, and athletic whites are just as celebrated. So it's not a rule that blacks must be more athletic than whites. Asian Americans, stereotyped as scientifically gifted, but any Asian Americans who just like math and science are not ostracized, and gifted non-Asians are welcomed with open arms. Or ethnicity, think about Norwegians. They're stereotyped as terrific skiers, but let's say you meet one who says, frankly, I hate to ski, nobody in the room gets upset. Why? Why not? Norwegians are stereotyped as great skiers, but a non-skiing Norwegian is completely fine. So what's going on here? The reason why not, because none of these stereotypes have strong or any implications for social hierarchies. By contrast, gender rules reinforce patriarchy or male dominance by explaining why men have more power than women. For example, men are braver and bolder, whereas women are weaker and meeker, which justifies the gender hierarchy. Okay, so if you break a prescriptive gender rule that supports the gender hierarchy, that's when the social trouble comes in. That's when you risk backlash, because you're challenging something that people view as very important: male dominance, patriarchy. In other words, strong women and weak men risk backlash because they challenge patriarchy. If women are men's equals in brains, bravery, leadership skills, etc., there becomes no legitimate reason for men having greater status and power. It just wipes out the justification. Backlash for stepping out of gender bounds reveals that the remedy for sex discrimination is not straightforward. Women cannot just act like men to get ahead. So this is kind of a preview of what we're going to learn about more in depth when we study backlash and the research that supports it. But I'll just mention in this first lecture that I've been studying backlash since the early 90s, and it wasn't until 2012 that I found evidence that the motivation for it is to reinforce patriarchy. So you'll be learning about that. But it just tells you how challenging it is to do this kind of work, that it took me all that time. Just think about all, decades before I finally landed on what the real motive was for backlash against agentic women and backlash against communal men. They challenge the gender hierarchy, and people don't want that hierarchy challenged. So they ostracize men and women who pierce it. Here's a recent example. Once Joe Biden selected Kamala Harris as his running mate, she faced backlash. On the left, they said, oh, she's too ambitious. She's not going to be a team player in Joe Biden's administration. And on the right, they said, oh, she's too nasty. And as you'll learn, it actually means the same thing. She's too agentic. And she's not alone. As we'll learn in the course, female politicians and business leaders face backlash because there's this double standard for agency. It's not only acceptable for men to be agentic, ambitious, self-promoting, aggressive, it's actually prescribed for men to be that way, right? But not for women. So therefore, a double standard just means what's good for the gander is not necessarily good for the goose, and vice versa, right? What one gender is expected to be or can get away with being, not necessarily so for the other gender. And agency, which is so important for getting ahead in life, that it deeply handicaps women, this particular double standard. And that brings me full circle back to a cartoon. What's the difference between being assertive and being aggressive? Answer, your gender. Agentic men are seen as assertive, but agentic women are viewed as aggressive, even when they display the exact same behaviors. And how do we know that? We know that from social science research, much of it conducted by myself, but not only myself. So this cartoon actually turns out to be a scientific fact. Questions or comments? I kind of threw a lot at you today to give you a preview, but like I say, I want you to get a sense of whether you want to hang in there with me for the rest of the semester, whether you are coming on Zoom to meet with me or not. So if you do have questions, comments, please email me if you can't attend the meetings on Zoom. Otherwise, if you can, I hope to see you soon.